welcome everybody watching on YouTube. It is pretty late. This will be a shorter episode, but hopefully I can make it worth your while. We're slowly but surely climbing up to 1200, and we're playing Lucho from Switzerland. Okay, let's go. D4, and we get potentially, I don't want to jinx it. Yes, looks like we're going to get another King's Indian. And we're facing the move E3. So it's funny, a couple of games ago, this actually I think was the previous speedrun episode, we faced this weird line knight c3 and bishop e3. And I warned people that for a while, at least until we hit like 1600, we're probably not going to face like the main King's Indian lines, which is why you really have to lay the groundwork in terms of understanding the ideas so that you can react if your opponent throws something unexpected at you. Because like this particular setup is not going to be in my chessable course. It's impossible to encapsulate all of White's possible setup because there's just a million of them. And the more important thing is to understand what setup you're going for and how to react to certain types of setups from your opponent. So White is just playing moves. I mean, E3, B3, that doesn't really change our reaction so far. The first step is kind of to play all the standard King's Indian moves. We can castle. And now we have to make like the big decision, which I talked about in the last King's Indian game. So you should really watch the previous speedrun episode, in particular, like the King's Indian game, because I'm going to build off of some of that knowledge. What I said then is that often in the King's Indian, there's like a choice at some point between playing the traditional King's Indian move, which is E7, E5, not immediately, but to prepare it, like to go D6 and E5. When you like learn the King's Indian, this is what people often want to do because this is like what's shown in books. But the sort of modern approach to the King's Indian is to understand that against certain setups, it's actually more efficient to play it kind of Benoni style by actually pushing C5 rather than E5. And there's many reasons why you would want to do that. I don't want to delve into them. Just the fact of the matter is that you don't want to automatically play D6 and E5 against all of your opponent's setups. In the last game, it was actually a good idea to play it Grunfeld style with D5. So you should maintain flexibility when it comes to deciding which pawn break you should carry out. I think against this particular setup, you could make a case for either going C5 or preparing E5. Both seem to be pretty good in my book. The benefit of C5 is that it would potentially create this standoff between the bishops, which actually could be good for us because White's king is still in the center. But I also want to kind of display the typical King's Indian way of playing it. So actually, let's go D6. And in this game, I'm going to show you how to carry out the E5 break, even though White's already positioned a bishop on B2, presumably, maybe not intentionally, but our opponent's trying to discourage us from playing E5. But the great thing about the King's Indian is you can usually force this break in almost any position. Okay, so White plays knight C3, and actually this changes my perception a little bit. So the problem with playing E5 in this position is that it allows a queen trade, and I don't really want to allow a queen trade. Not that the endgame is bad, but I think that we can go for more. So because our opponent played knight C3, I actually now like the move C5 a lot more. And there's a pretty simple reason why, which is that after White plays D5, which is kind of the standard reaction at a higher level, like at this level, we're probably going to face D takes C5 more often, which is even better for us. But after White plays D5, we have this sort of tactical idea to jump in with the knight to E4 and expose the bishop on B2 and potentially seize the bishop pair. So I'll show you after the game. We also have the move Queen A5, which obviously could be very, very unpleasant for White, and we're coming in very fast. So this is kind of what I'm going to do. We're going to try to put pressure on White's center, but we're going to do it in a very careful way. If we play knight C6 here, we're allowing White to push D5 with tempo. So let's reserve that move until a little bit later, and let's actually start with Queen A5, which is a very challenging move for White to face because we're already setting up the pretty standard idea of knight E4. And we're kind of just playing on the queen side, and we're waiting to develop these two pieces. White's played bishop D3. So this prevents the move knight E4, but because White didn't position their bishop on E2, we now have this idea of playing bishop G4 at the right moment. So when is the right moment? Well, it's not now, because the reason we played Queen A5 is that now we can play knight C6, and you should pause the video and see if you can figure out what our response is going to be to D5, because we have a tactic in response to D5, pretty simple tactic that wins a pawn. And for this reason, we're starting to put serious pressure on the d4 pawn. And you can kind of see how our moves are starting to come together. You don't even have to pause the video. You can just think along with me. So you might say, oh, it's like knight e4, which is the right idea, but you have a better execution. Like if you're already moving the knight, you might as well grab the pawn on d5 because you're just winning a pawn. It's pretty easy to calculate. C takes d5. We play bishop takes c3 check. The bishops get traded, and then white's position is in shambles. Boom. Easy clap. Okay, so bishop takes c3. Very important that this is a check. And white's position collapses. Also, white can't play queen d2. This is a very common blunder at this level to play queen d2 kind of reactively tilting because people don't really want to move their king and blunder this rook on a1. This is like a little bit of whole board awareness. Okay, king e2, our opponent bites the bullet, but this doesn't bring much relief. Now, often one mistake I see people making is that when they win a little bit of material like a pawn, they tend to kind of rest on their laurels. So your instinct might be to like drop back to d8 or maybe trade off the knights with knight e5, but we have a better way to play. Now, let's not forget our knight is hanging, but we don't want to just stop at one pawn. White's position is collapsing, and we want to seize the opportunity before white consolidates. So the instinctive move for me is knight b4. It hits the pawn, it pressures the bishop, and this knight is very stable. Yeah, this is really bad. White is lost. Rook to c1. Okay. Now we have a really fancy move that we could play. I'm trying to figure out if it's also good, which is the most important, which is the priority. I think it is also good. It's actually a really sexy move. Now, I think some of you probably understand the idea, and you might think it's knight takes d5, but I don't love knight takes d5. The point is, if white takes the rook, we recapture with a fork, but we have a better way to do it, which is to take on a2. Because this also hits the rook, our opponent takes and goes into it, and now we win the game. We're up a ton of material. Takes, I'll go through it a little bit more slowly after the game. Yeah, now the rest is easy. We have this big queenside majority, and we have the extra exchange. So the big next step is going to be to open up some files for our rooks. Okay, so here we have a choice. I think bishop g4 is a great move, just trading off another pair of minor pieces. But if you want to win this efficiently, my instinct is to open up this rook. So you might say, well, let's go a5 and a4. But if you play a5 immediately, you're creating a weak square on b5, which white could occupy with the bishop. This is pedantic, is it's not really going to matter here, but let's start with bishop d7, because this is going to make a5, a4 smoother. Would my opponent have played bishop b5 at this level? Probably not, but that's not the point of the speedrun, is to build these good habits early on. Now we play a5. f5 is worse, because if you push the pawn to f4, you want to make sure that your opponent can't just keep things locked up. Okay, so bishop c2. Now, obviously, we should go b5. And now we're just pushing a4 and winning the game. Yeah, a4. Easy. Creating a passed pawn. And also opening up the b file, which we're going to occupy with our other rook. Okay, now our opponent might be going to c4, but I'm immediately seeing that's not actually a problem because of bishop to b5, pinning and potentially winning the knight. Well, it doesn't win the knight, but it does trade off the knight, which allows our pawn to inch forward, so we're just trading. I'm playing quickly here because everything is very simple. Now we want to push the pawn to a2, so we can go rook b4, we can go rook b2. It really doesn't matter. Let's start with rook b4, forcing the bishop back, and then we'll go up to b2. Just tying down this rook. If the bishop moves again, we'll go a2. Yeah, bishop moves again, we'll go a2. And now it's easy. Now we could play rook. I think a lot of people, they're taught that the most important thing is to trade pieces. So they'll go rook b1 and they'll give up the a pawn, but that'll take longer to convert. There's no reason for us to give up this pawn. The easier way to win is just to chase this bishop away with the other rook a4, and then to push the c pawn if necessary. Yeah, c4. Yeah, this is a bit boring for like more advanced players, but still. c3, c2, and we win. Okay, takes. And now the last step is just to get this rook to b1. We don't really care what our opponent is doing. And we make a queen. Yeah, let's recapture. And our opponent resigns. Cool. So a pretty simple game. I mean, the big blunder happened on move 9, but it happened because we chose the right pawn break. Okay, so let's quickly talk about the opening. Yeah, our opponent played e3. Now, e3 in and of itself is not a bad move. If white follows it up normally. Like, again, the main line is knight c3 and e4. And this is kind of the entry point to a million different King's Indian variations, which I talked about in the last video. E3 and b3. Again, if you turn on the engine, it's probably like still equal. So you shouldn't think of this as like absolutely terrible. So we played d6, and our opponent played knight c3. I was expecting knight f3. And here I'll teach you an important idea that's going to happen again at some point. Now, I wouldn't have necessarily played this move, but actually you can play the move e5 in this position. And this looks like a flat out blunder, but those of you who play the King's Indian might know this idea. In this position, you can actually move the knight away or move it up to g4, but knight fd7 is more common. And the e5 pawn is toast. You're attacking it 3 times. You can't defend it. And most importantly, white can't move it because the bishop falls. So where is this idea most commonly applied? It's most commonly applied when white plays like the Zukertort type setup or the double fianchetto with b3. If you want to play a King's Indian setup in response, which you absolutely can, very often you get this type of situation. So like you play d6, white plays d4. And full disclosure, like actually I prefer the move c5 here, but you can play e5. This is a legitimate variation. And if white takes, again, you have knight g4, you have knight fd7. And as a matter of fact, in some situations, you can even sack the pawn on e5. So if I remember correctly, the engine really likes this line, nbd7, e5, d takes e5. Now, traditionally, black always plays knight g4 here and then recaptures the pawn. And white is a little bit better. Majority of the time, you go like knight g4. So this is just an idea to keep in mind. But even if you can't orchestrate this, just because your opponent fianchettos doesn't mean you can't prepare e5 in more conventional terms. For example, you can also play c6 here, which is a move that you often see in King's Indian positions, and then queen c7. And then you can still play e5 without any of the tactical shenanigans. So the takeaway is that just because your opponent fianchettos doesn't mean you can't play e5. But then our opponent played knight to c3, which immediately made me realize now this diagonal is exploitable, and I was able to switch at the drop of a hat, which I mentioned in the last video. You should be able to do that based on your opponent's setup. For example, in the mainline King's Indian, for the vast majority of variations, I'm proposing e5. Like in the mainline, e5 is very common, and c5 is considered a rather dubious move. It's a legitimate line, but it's pretty dubious. But if white plays this very common modern line, which is h4, now the situation has changed, and here c5 is a really good move because it turns out you can play this Benko Gambit style, and white has made this very compromising move h4, so the white king often gets stuck in the center, and so it makes sense to open up the queen side. So right now, you shouldn't be focused on trying to remember all of this. You should be focused on the bigger picture. So we played c5, and again, if white plays d5, this diagonal opens up, and we have this idea to play knight e4. Maybe not immediately. I actually was planning to start with queen a5, and now to play knight e4, which is a cool idea you should put in your pocket. Not literally, but after knight takes e4, you're able to trade queens, and then you're able to grab the bishop pair. Are we winning? Like, no, but we have the bishop pair and we have an amazing diagonal. And, you should learn that sometimes tactical operations result in positional advantages. You can't always guarantee immediate victory. Yeah, so just to show you something, a lot of these ideas, and I say this periodically, you might think, yeah, well, this is just one speedrun game. But if you listen diligently, they actually do happen in real life. Like, these are not just empty words. So in the last 10 seconds, I ran a quick search. And here's one example. A game from a completely different opening. The East German Championship from 1957. Tournament, which I'm sure everybody watching is intimately familiar with. And has studied the games from this tournament very carefully. Okay, so in this position, what do you think white played and how did black punish it? Little extra question for you. What do you think happened? It's white to play. and how was it punished in the game? I mean, clearly white is a decent player if this is the final of the championship. Yeah, white castles. And again, you should already spot the King's Indian pattern. Black played knight takes e4. Even better, you win a pawn. Boom. Bishop takes b2. Black is up a pawn and went on to win the game. Now, you might say, well, okay, great, but, you know, this is like some weak player. Strong players are not going to miss this type of trick. Wrong. Okay, here's another example. Actually, a Polgar game. 2400 against Zsuzsa Polgar, Judith's sister. In this position, white plays bishop b2, black plays queen a5. You know where this is going. White plays queen d2. Again, knight takes c4, queen takes c2, bishop takes b2. So you get the point. If you really want to be diligent, you should keep careful track of these ideas because you never know when they're going to arise. All right, back to the game. Sorry, that was a bit of a detour, but hopefully it was worth it. Yeah, so back to the game. Queen a5, bishop d3, knight c6. Very important. We didn't play this move here because now white can go d5 with tempo. Here, white played d5 and walked into this tactic. If white would have castled instead, then my idea was to play bishop g4 and to start applying pressure on the d4 pawn. Now, again, we want to encourage white to play d5. And here you need a little bit of subtlety. Knight takes d5 is now a big mistake because of cd, and this move is no longer a check. So black loses a piece. But you have a lot of alternatives. You can play, for example, the great move knight e5, and you've got a lot of pressure on white's pieces. Or you can even play knight b4. And that's basically all I have for this game. Once we won the pawn, the game is basically over. Knight takes a2 was pretty. The only thing that I was considering here was rook c2, which is a bit of an annoying move because it also hits the knight. But I spotted that we can actually play queen takes b3. And very importantly, if white tries to skewer the knight, we can drop back with a check. And one last question for you guys. After king to d3, what is the best move for black? Well, actually, no, you have bishop f5. So I was going to say, don't take on d1 because if bishop takes b3 and the knight is suddenly trapped, you can actually desperado the queen first and then take white's queen. This is a classic trick that you should also be aware of. In any case, once this happened, the game is over. Okay, I think this is a shorter episode. We got time for one 5-minute game. Let's do it. For white, 1600. Okay, so we're playing. Oh yeah, I forgot that we're actually higher rated in Blitz. Great, so we'll get a little variety, which I like. Okay, so we're facing the Philidor again, and as some of you might remember, I like starting with bishop c4. It's a very flexible approach. Okay, bishop b7, and here we have, again, a choice. We can play d4, or we can continue developing with knight c3. Doesn't really matter. And again, here we have a broader choice between d4, but we can also play this very positionally. And I've told people before that I really like this setup against the Philidor. It avoids a lot of theory, and it transitions the game into sort of an Italian type setup, which people who play the Philidor are typically not very comfortable with. And what I'm talking about is the move d3. It seems a little bit cowardly, and yes, d4 is strictly speaking better, but if I play this right, our opponent is going to get very uncomfortable and might make some early mistakes. So again, now it doesn't really matter how we play this as long as you're developing your pieces. a6, we can play a4 just to stop b5. Knight b to d7. It's a good idea to throw in h3. If you're an Italian player, you should know this. Not because bishop g4 is that scary. It's just like good to play a prophylactic move. Now, again, I'm going to make a very Italian-esque move, dropping this bishop away. And now we're going to start going after our opponent. So this bishop being on a2, combined with the fact that black played h6, it alerts me to the presence of two very juicy ideas. The first one is the kind of simple maneuver knight h4, and then either knight f5 or knight g6. But the second one is even more primitive, just to play bishop b3, queen to d2, and then try to sack on h6, which is surprisingly effective even against GMs. Because black has kind of set themselves up for failure. The knight on b7 is blocking the rook. He's kind of very clumped together. So we're going to start at least threatening to sack. And immediately our opponent sees it and blunders f7, like clockwork. Okay, now, again, we have a choice. We shouldn't just immediately drop back to a2. I said this in the last game. Once you've won a little bit of material, pause for a second and make sure that you can't extract further gains from the situation. I really like bishop e6 here. Potentially setting up another trade. and actually setting up another blunder. Our opponent has blundered another pawn. Can you take it in either order? No. Notice the bishop on e7, so knight e5 would be a blunder. Don't try to be fancy when it's not necessary. But let's grab another pawn. Now we have 2 extra pawns, and it's time for the conversion stage. Okay. Queen to e6. Again, pretty wide choice of different types of conversions. I think a lot of you would prefer f4. I don't like f4 because it's very weakening and it allows this annoying response knight h5. Instead, I'm kind of thinking, okay, where would this knight be well placed? And you might say, well, let's go back to f3. But again, knight f3 potentially walks into this exchange sack on f3. So I actually like knight c4, which, yes, we're walking into b5, but b5 actually helps our knight get to where I want it to go anyway, which is e3. And the reason I want to get to e3 is because then we have access to f5. But before we do any of that, let's get out of the pin because our opponent is threatening queen takes c4. So let's just shift the queen to e2, also stopping knight h5. And now we're ready to continue improving. Yeah, our opponent has no moves. My guess is he's going to go b5. Okay, great. He went b5, so obviously we're going to take, opening up the a file. And now we're going to drop back to e3. And now look at how nicely our knights are placed. Probably we're going to face b4, and we do need to be very careful. Notice that the queens are aligned. So you want to be careful about a move like knight d5 because you might end up blundering a knight to like this classic trick with rook takes d5. But this is clear desperation. I think we can just take this pawn. And intuitively, I'm understanding that after knight takes e4, like that's just not scary. Okay, here goes the third pawn, also offering a queen trade, which is accepted. Great. There's a fourth pawn hanging. Okay, our opponent just starts blundering their pieces and resigns. Okay, simple game. Pretty straightforward. And it really shows the virtues of this d3 setup against the Philidor. People don't like these close center positions. And immediately our opponent made a big blunder. Rook e8 already is... This move is okay, but our opponent should have followed it up with knight f8. And we played him like a fiddle, because after knight f8, actually the sack is totally unsound here. Like in this particular version, it's unsound. So one good instructive question for people is, how would you defend? Pause the video. If you were black here, how would you try to rebuff this attack? And I think there is a very, very clean move that just defends everything. And then white has no follow-up. Yeah, so there's actually 2 knights that can go to h7. You don't want to go with this knight because you're allowing this classic trick, the check on g6. You want to go with the other knight, knight 6 h7. The reason being this knight holds g6. Now your bishops are involved in the defense and white is at a dead end. White has no follow-up. Like, for example, white tries to get the knight into the attack, but it's very slow. And now black has a pretty wide choice. I mean, you can tell that this attack is going nowhere. There's this move. You can, like, fianchetto your bishop. This is a common defensive strategy. Or you could play bishop g5. Like, there's a pretty wide choice of options. But you shouldn't be afraid of this sack in every situation. But our opponent reacted to this move. Like, they saw that this was a possibility and immediately went king h7, forgetting to check the drawbacks of this move. Knight f8 is a really nice move for black because black is preparing bishop e6 as well as knight g6. Probably in response to this move, I would have played d4. And this is another thing to keep in mind. A lot of people are like, okay, I played d3. I can never play d4 ever again. I see this with London system players who like refuse to play the move c4. They're like, no matter what, like my opponent plays h6, I'm still going to play c3. It's like, c4 controls the center. You should be able to play this move. Just because we played d3 doesn't mean that later on we can't switch to a different plan that involves opening the center. And the reason I switched to it here is because once the knight left d7, the e5 pawn is now tender. And once black plays knight g6, now I think this sacrifice should be seriously considered. Because after the capture, we actually are threatening queen takes g6. So black doesn't have knight h7. And if black has to burn a tempo moving this knight away, well, then things start getting very dicey for black. Maybe still not great for us, but at least it's something. And bishop e6, the pawn is overloaded. So we just take, and then we win the knight. And if black plays knight f4, it still doesn't really help because we can take and take twice. So one of the big takeaways from this speedrun episode is be flexible Try to be flexible in your ideas. Don't like identify yourself with one particular setup. And your play should depend entirely on what your opponent does. So after knight f8 d4, if black takes it, well, then we get a very nice version of the Philidor. So king h7, we take the pawn, we drop back to e6, we take another pawn. And here, an instructive moment where I didn't play f4 because after knight h5, things get very dicey on the dark squares. Why are we causing ourselves problems? The big takeaway is that you shouldn't be afraid of these one-move threats. Notice how powerful this is as something that dissuades you from a move. Like a lot of people see b5 and they're like, well, this is bad for us. Why? It just actually helps your knight get to where it wants to go. And they're like, well, what about b4? Again, it's a one-move threat. One-move threats are not inherently dangerous. Notice that your opponent has just weakened a bunch of these light squares and helped your knight get to better positions. Of course, a move like b5 can be scary, but this is not one of those situations. Queen e2, always staying on alert, and then just taking all of the material that was offered to us. All right, guys, I got to get going, but this was a bit of a shorter episode, but it is very late, so hopefully I can be forgiven by the YouTube crowd. I will have a longer episode for you as my next episode. I promise you that. I'll try to do one in the next few days. Hope you guys enjoyed, and this is where we will wrap up. I'll see you guys later. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.